Yesterday, life was normal. You woke up in a comfy bed. You prepared your favorite breakfast. You put on your favorite outfit. You cherished the freedom of another new day. Today, life is an inescapable hell. In the blink of an eye, your freedom is snatched from you. Your identity is entirely stripped from you. Everything you had once worked so hard for is now non-existent, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. For the occupants of both European concentration camps and American internment camps during World War II, this unexpected rate of freedom completely changed millions of innocent lives forever and introduced a new outlook on humanity. In response to the Pearl Harbor attacks by Japan in December of 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt established Japanese internment camps through his Executive Order 9066 during World War II. Roosevelt signed the order on February 19, 1942, in hopes to prevent espionage on U.S. land. Immediately, military zones were built in states that had large Japanese American populations, including Oregon, California, and Washington. The order declared that all Americans of Japanese ancestry would be relocated to these military zones to be carefully monitored and confined. Within Japanese relocation centers, several families were tightly housed together in barracks and ate in communal dining areas. The relocation centers resembled towns. They included post offices, work facilities, schools, and farmland for crops and livestock. However, these towns were enclosed with barbed wire and guard towers, with minimal access to the rest of the world. The camp supplied their occupants with a single drop light, army cots, and a coal, gas, or wood heater. Over time, occupants built their own furniture and planted gardens. The War Relocation Authority tried to make conditions as normal as possible by creating local newspapers, a degree of self-government, sports leagues, and social events. Japanese Americans waited in long lines to be served little food in the mess halls. According to NPR.org, they were fed government commodity foods and cast-off meat from Army surplus: hot dogs, ketchup, kidneys, Spam, and potatoes. The Japanese diet and family table were erased. Because it was wartime, there was strict rationing for everyone. For example, at the Topaz internment camp in Utah, no one but children under 12 could receive milk. One of the biggest impacts of the camps was that mothers could no longer cook meals for their children. The family table, with its traditions and conversations, became non-existent. Employment at the camps was not mandatory, but most adults chose to work as a way to pass the time, earn a wage, and help with the necessary daily operations of the camps. Most people worked full-time, typically about 44 hours per week. In the beginning, occupants were not paid for their work, but this eventually changed over time. Rates of pay varied depending on the type of work and the skill of the worker. There was a wide variety of jobs available at the internment camps, from healthcare workers to janitors. Each camp had its own hospital, police department, and fire department. Japanese American doctors, nurses, and other hospital staff worked under white directors. Because school was mandatory, Japanese American teachers were employed, but they earned much less than white teachers. Each camp had its own newspapers, so there were jobs for journalists, typesetters, illustrators, and paper boys. Camps also had stores that employed cashiers and sales representatives. Mess hall workers and cooks helped serve the camp's 3 daily meals. Other jobs included office work to manage camp administration, carpenters to help with ongoing construction projects, and sanitation workers to clean the communal bathrooms. Many occupants turned to farming, where they managed their own crops and livestock within the camp's grounds. They made a significant contribution to the nation's economy in terms of agriculture, producing vegetables, meat, dairy, and more. Many American civil rights and human rights were broken within the internment camps. First, the occupants' religious freedoms were violated, and they were not allowed to practice the Shinto religion. Instead, they were encouraged to follow Christianity, and Catholic churches were built within the camps. Additionally, the government searched the homes of Japanese Americans, often without search warrants, looking for any items that identified them as being Japanese. Items that appeared as contraband, such as shortwave radios, were confiscated. As a result, many Japanese Americans destroyed their personal photographs and Japanese traces prior to these searches. Japanese Americans were deprived of their liberty and property as they were forcibly removed from their homes and locked up in detention camps without the required statement of charges and trial by jury. Even though Japanese Americans were held against their will in barbed wire compounds under armed guard, the government called the event an evacuation or relocation. Japanese Americans were denied the right to vote in public elections because they were forbidden from returning home to vote at their place of residence. Although elections were held inside the camps, the prisoners' self-government had no power to regulate their own welfare or direct their own destiny. Meanwhile, in Europe, Nazi concentration camps were constructed in Adolf Hitler's attempt to imprison Jews, non-Jewish Poles, the mentally challenged, Roma people, homosexuals, and Soviet prisoners of war. The perpetrators used their camps for a variety of purposes, including forced labor, detention of people thought to be enemies of the state, and mass murder. Their goal was to eliminate real and perceived enemies of the state. People were transported to concentration camps by freight cars, cattle cars, or passenger trains, and the torture began as soon as they stepped out onto the cars, which were often filled to twice their capacity. People were crammed in like animals without a place to sit. Dreadful living conditions were the cause of the many pandemics and diseases that swept through the concentration camps. In Auschwitz I, prisoners were crammed into old brick barracks. They slept on uncomfortable three-tier wooden bunk beds. Because of overcrowding in Auschwitz I, basements and lofts were converted into living quarters as well. Some prisoners slept in wooden stable barracks. The stalls contained three-tier wooden bunks, and several hundred prisoners lived in each barrack. There were leaky roofs, dampness, lice, and various types of vermin and rats. There was a constant shortage of water for washing and severe lack of suitable sanitary facilities. Before the arrival at the concentration camps, each inmate had to undergo a selection procedure which identified their group. Healthy and strong men were in one group, while women, children, and elderly were put into another. Soldiers focused on separating the people of the same family. People were then stripped of their valuables, and an identification number was tattooed on their forearm, which took away the victims' identities and labeled them as nothing more than an inmate. In extermination camps like Auschwitz, people were killed in gas chambers or bullets were fired through their body. Concentration camps dehumanized inmates in every possible way. Prisoners received 3 meals per day. In the morning, they were given only a half-liter of coffee or tea. Lunch consisted of about a liter of watery, unappetizing soup. Dinner consisted of about 300 grams of black bread, served with about 25 grams of sausage or cheese. The bread served in the evening was supposed to cover the needs of the following morning as well, but the starving prisoners usually ate the entire portion at once. Insufficient nutrition combined with the intense labor destroyed the occupants' bodies, such as their fat, muscle mass, and the tissues of the internal organs. Many people starved to death. An SS main economic and administrative office decree of March 31, 1942 established a minimum working day of 11 hours in all concentration camps. Employment was mandatory for all females and male inmates. At Auschwitz, labor was one of the means used to destroy prisoners. They worked in different sections of the economy. In the beginning, they worked at building the camp by leveling the ground, creating new blocks and buildings, laying roads, and digging drainage ditches. Later, Nazi industries abused the inmates for cheap prisoner labor. The pace of the work, the starvation rations of food, and the constant beatings heightened the death rate. Some prisoners dug coal, produced weapons and chemicals, and built and expanded industrial plants. Without question, almost every single civil and human right was violated within the concentration camps. The Holocaust violated human rights by stripping people of everything they had a right to and refusing to treat them humanely. Families were evicted from their homes and forced into ghettos where they could not leave. They had to obey the will of police or face harsh consequences. The Nazis raided their homes and stole or destroyed all their belongings. The soldiers carefully monitored all the occupants, counting them and making sure no one left or escaped. They had been taken from ghettos to concentration camps where conditions only worsened. They were detained against their will and constantly faced the possibility of being shot or murdered. They were cut off from the rest of society. By keeping them isolated from the real world, the Nazis were able to alienate and dehumanize them. After facing the brutal conditions of the camps, the inmates became both mentally and physically weak to the degree of death. Nazi concentration camps violated civil and human rights through constant unfair treatment and torture. At concentration camps in Europe, the Nazis had the intent to torture their occupants to their deaths without mercy and exterminate entire populations. At relocation centers in America, the government had the intent to separate Japanese Americans from the rest of the nation to try and prevent other Japanese attacks on U.S. land. At both camps, people were imprisoned and treated unfairly. The purpose of the Japanese internment camps was not to torture its occupants, while Nazi concentration camps were aimed at working its occupants to death. Although Japanese Americans faced uncomfortable living conditions at internment camps and were greatly discriminated by Americans, life in internment camps was much more humane than life in Nazi concentration camps. The Americans fed them and didn't aim to kill them. Japanese Americans were also able to have fun living in the camps through social events and entertainment, and many civilians still chose to join the army to display their loyalty to the United States. While the two groups had very different motives for their captivities, no human being should ever be imprisoned against their will.